There's a specific move that almost never appears early in a relationship, almost never appears during an ordinary rough patch, and almost never appears while there's still some reliable amount of effort left to extract through the usual channels. It only shows up at the very end, right at the exact moment someone has genuinely, finally stopped caring, and it tends to be the single most convincing performance an avoidant will ever give in the entire relationship. Not because the feeling behind it is necessarily fake in every sense, but because its timing, its intensity, and its sudden fluency in exactly the language that person has been longing to hear for years reveal something considerably more calculated than the raw, unpolished vulnerability it's dressed up to resemble. This is the final trick, and it deserves to be named and understood clearly because it tends to work precisely when someone is at their most fragile, standing right at the edge of walking away for good, holding on to the very last, thinnest thread of hope that they might have been wrong about giving up. It's worth naming why this specific moment, standing right at that edge, carries so much more vulnerability to this particular trick than almost any earlier point throughout the entire relationship. By the time someone reaches genuine, complete detachment, they've typically already absorbed considerable pain, already extended considerable patience, already tried, likely repeatedly, to have the relationship become something more sustainable than it ultimately was. Reaching detachment, after all of that effort, represents genuine exhaustion, and genuine exhaustion, however healthy and however necessary the resulting boundary actually is, doesn't eliminate the underlying hope that originally motivated all that earlier effort. This trick specifically exploits the gap between exhausted, hard-won detachment and hope that remains, quietly, still present underneath it. Precisely the gap that makes this particular moment so much more vulnerable than any earlier point in the relationship's history. Understanding exactly how this trick operates, why it appears specifically at this exact moment and almost never before it, and how to tell it apart from something genuinely different underneath, might be the single most protective piece of information available to anyone standing at that particular edge right now. Anyone listening who has recently noticed an avoidant partner suddenly, almost unrecognizably, becoming everything they always wished they would be, right around the time they finally stopped waiting for it, deserves to understand exactly what's happening before deciding what to do with it. It's worth naming, before going further, why this particular topic deserves such careful, dedicated attention, rather than being folded into a more general discussion of avoidant panic or avoidant reconciliation attempts explored elsewhere. This specific trick occupies a genuinely unique position within the broader landscape of avoidant behavior, precisely because it arrives loaded with so much of what makes it difficult to recognize clearly in the moment, genuine feeling emotion, precise, specific tailoring to exactly what's been wanted, and timing so exquisitely calibrated to the exact moment of maximum vulnerability that resisting its pull requires considerably more than simple awareness of avoidant psychology in general. It requires a specific, dedicated understanding of this particular pattern, distinct enough from ordinary avoidant behavior that it warrants its own careful, separate examination. To understand why this specific trick only appears at this specific moment, it helps to return to something that's been explored elsewhere regarding how an avoidance psychology tracks the relationship's ongoing viability. For most of a relationship's duration, an avoidant operates according to an unconscious, largely unexamined assumption that the other person's investment and effort will remain reliably available, regardless of how inconsistently that investment gets reciprocated. This assumption functions almost like a kind of relational insurance, a background belief that no matter how much distance gets created, no matter how many boundaries get tested or ignored, the relationship's continuation isn't actually in serious jeopardy. This assumption tends to hold for a remarkably long time, considerably longer than most people expect, precisely because it's rarely tested directly. Ordinary complaints, ordinary requests for more consistency, even ordinary threats to leave, don't actually challenge this underlying assumption in any way that requires the avoidant to take them seriously as genuine possibilities. These signals get filed away as the normal, expected texture of a relationship under some strain, uncomfortable but not existentially threatening, precisely because the underlying insurance policy, the assumption that this person isn't actually going anywhere, remains intact throughout. What finally breaks this assumption isn't anger, isn't an ultimatum, and isn't even a direct, explicit statement of intent to leave. It's something both simpler and more definitive, the felt absence of continued emotional investment, detected less through anything said directly, and more through a kind of ambient shift in tone, energy, and effort that becomes impossible to explain away, using any of the usual reassuring narratives. This is the moment the insurance policy actually lapses, and it tends to trigger a considerably more urgent, considerably more calculated response than anything an avoidant has deployed at any earlier point in the relationship. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone who has spent years living in a house they've never bothered to maintain properly, aware in some vague background way that upkeep matters, but never treating that upkeep as genuinely urgent, because the house has always simply continued standing regardless of how much neglect it absorbed. Then imagine this same person receiving unmistakable, undeniable evidence that the house's foundation has finally actually begun to fail, that continued neglect will result, imminently, in genuine, irreversible collapse, rather than simply more of the same tolerable disrepair. The response to this kind of undeniable evidence tends to be dramatically different from the low-grade, occasional maintenance offered beforehand. Sudden, urgent, considerable effort, mobilized specifically because the previous assumption of indefinite tolerance has finally, unmistakably broken. This is close to what produces the final trick being described throughout this exploration. It isn't simply more of the same intermittent effort an avoidant has offered throughout the relationship. It's a considerably more intense, more urgent, and more calculated response, mobilized specifically because the underlying assumption that finally allowed the relationship to continue indefinitely without genuine risk has just unmistakably collapsed. It's worth naming exactly what this trick tends to look like in practice, because its specific texture matters enormously for distinguishing it clearly from something genuinely different underneath. It helps to name several specific, recognizable components of this trick individually, because seeing them listed clearly makes the overall pattern considerably easier to recognize while it's actually happening, rather than only in hindsight. One common component involves sudden, detailed nostalgia, vivid, specific references to early moments in the relationship, particular memories recalled with striking clarity and emotional weight, designed, whether consciously or not, to reawaken the emotional connection to a period before the relationship's difficulties accumulated. This nostalgia tends to be strikingly more detailed and more emotionally vivid than anything the avoidant has offered throughout the relationship's more recent history, precisely because its function is to bypass recent disappointment by reconnecting directly to an earlier, less complicated emotional state. Another common component involves sudden, explicit, future-oriented promises, specific plans and commitments regarding exactly what will change going forward, often remarkably detailed and remarkably responsive to whatever specific complaints or requests were raised throughout the relationship's history. This component tends to feel considerably more comprehensive and considerably more specific than any promises offered at earlier points during the relationship, precisely because it's being generated under the acute pressure of imminent total loss rather than under the more diffuse, lower stakes pressure of ordinary relational conflict. A further component involves a kind of sudden, uncharacteristic willingness to accept responsibility, explicit acknowledgement of specific behaviours and their specific impact, sometimes accompanied by visible remorse or distress that stands in sharp contrast to the more defensive or minimising responses the avoidant has typically offered when these same issues were raised earlier in the relationship. This sudden accountability can feel genuinely moving, And it often is, in the sense that the distress being expressed is often genuinely felt in that specific moment. It simply doesn't, on its own, predict whether that same accountability will persist once the immediate crisis has passed and the pressure driving it has diminished. A final component, somewhat more subtle than the others, involves a kind of urgency specifically oriented around securing an immediate response or immediate reassurance, a persistent, if sometimes gentle, pressure to resolve the situation quickly, to provide immediate forgiveness or immediate recommitment, rather than allowing the more measured, patient timeline that genuine reconciliation actually requires. This urgency, more than any other single component, tends to be one of the more reliable indicators that panic rather than patient reflection is driving the performance, since genuine sustainable change doesn't typically require immediate resolution in order to feel secure. It can tolerate patience, uncertainty, and a slower timeline, precisely because it isn't dependent on urgently closing the gap before the underlying fear has a chance to reassert itself. This trick typically involves a sudden dramatic increase in exactly the kind of emotional fluency and vulnerability that had been conspicuously absent throughout the relationship's entire prior history. Words that were previously withheld arrive suddenly, often with considerable intensity, explicit declarations of love, explicit acknowledgement of specific mistakes, explicit promises regarding future change, delivered with a level of detail and emotional expression that feels almost unrecognizable compared to how the avoidant has communicated throughout the rest of the relationship. This sudden fluency often extends beyond words alone into behavior as well, grand visible gestures that stand out sharply against the relationship's prior pattern, an uncharacteristic willingness to have the difficult, direct conversations previously avoided at almost any cost, sometimes even genuine tears or visible emotional distress in circumstances where composure had always previously been maintained without exception. Taken together, this entire package tends to feel, in the moment it's received, like exactly the transformation that had been hoped for throughout the relationship's entire duration, arriving finally at precisely the moment it seems too late to matter. This timing deserves careful, honest examination, because it's precisely what distinguishes this trick from genuine transformation, even though the two can look remarkably similar on the surface. Genuine change, the kind that reflects real, internal, psychological work rather than acute, crisis-driven panic, doesn't typically arrive with this specific timing, appearing suddenly and completely only once someone else's departure has become imminent and undeniable. Genuine change tends to develop more gradually, often triggered by some combination of internal reflection and external circumstance that doesn't depend entirely on the precise moment someone else finally, completely runs out of patience. The fact that this particular transformation arrives so precisely, so suspiciously well-timed to the exact moment of maximum leverage is itself one of the clearest signals available regarding what's actually driving it. It's worth naming, too, why this specific trick tends to be so remarkably effective, despite its suspicious timing, because understanding its effectiveness explains why so many genuinely intelligent, genuinely perceptive people find themselves pulled back in by it despite everything they might logically know about the relationship's history. It helps to name, more specifically, why this effectiveness varies so considerably from person to person, since this trick doesn't land with equal force on everyone who encounters it. People whose own early relational history involved intermittent, unpredictable reward, affection, and attention that arrived unreliably rather than consistently tend to be particularly susceptible to exactly this kind of sudden, intense reversal, precisely because their own nervous systems learned early on to invest hope disproportionately in exactly these dramatic, high-intensity moments, having been shaped by a pattern where such moments, historically, represented the clearest available signal of genuine care. This isn't a flaw or a weakness. It reflects an entirely understandable adaptation to whatever earlier relational environment first taught this particular pattern of hope and investment. People whose own early relational history involved more consistent, reliable emotional availability tend to respond somewhat differently to this same trick, often experiencing genuine confusion or suspicion at its sudden, dramatic intensity, precisely because consistency, rather than dramatic intensity, has always represented their primary internal signal of genuine, trustworthy care. This distinction matters because it explains why this same trick can feel utterly convincing to one person, while feeling immediately, instinctively suspicious to another, encountering the exact same words and the exact same behavior. Recognizing which pattern more accurately describes one's own history offers useful, additional insight into exactly how much extra caution and deliberate, conscious skepticism might be necessary to counteract an instinctive pull that, for entirely understandable reasons, rooted in one's own formative history, may be considerably stronger than it would be for someone with a different relational background. This trick works precisely because it offers exactly what was being longed for the entire time, delivered with a level of specificity and emotional intensity that feels in the moment completely undeniable. Hope, especially hope that's been suppressed and managed for a long time in service of finally, painfully letting go, doesn't actually disappear the moment someone decides to stop caring. It remains available, quietly, right beneath the surface, ready to be reactivated by exactly the right combination of words and gestures, precisely the combination this particular trick has been engineered, whether consciously or not, to provide. There's something important worth naming here regarding the specific psychological mechanism producing this trick, because understanding the mechanism helps clarify why it isn't simply calculated deception in the deliberate, manipulative sense that word usually implies. It's worth naming more specifically the range this trick actually operates across, because it doesn't manifest identically in every case, and understanding this range helps calibrate exactly how much suspicion versus compassion feels appropriate in any specific situation. At one end of this range sits something closer to genuine involuntary panic, an avoidant who is, in that specific moment, experiencing real, overwhelming fear of loss, expressing that fear as honestly as their limited emotional vocabulary allows, without any deliberate strategic calculation behind the specific words or gestures being used. This end of the range deserves to be understood with real compassion, even while the practical response, patient observation over time, remains identical regardless of where along this range a particular instance actually falls. At the other end of this range sits something considerably more deliberate, an avoidant who has learned, whether through this specific relationship or through prior ones, that this particular kind of performance reliably works to prevent departure, and who deploys it with at least some degree of conscious awareness that saying these particular words, offering this particular level of vulnerability, tends to produce the desired effect of preventing an otherwise imminent loss. This end of the range deserves to be named honestly as something closer to genuine manipulation, even when it's not necessarily calculated with full, cynical awareness in every single moment it occurs. Most instances of this trick likely fall somewhere between these two ends, some genuine panic mixed with some degree of learned, semi-conscious awareness regarding what tends to work. This mixture doesn't need to be resolved precisely in order to respond wisely, since the practical test already described, patient observation over meaningful time remains equally valid and equally necessary regardless of where along this spectrum a particular instance actually falls. What matters most isn't determining exactly how conscious or unconscious the performance was in the moment it occurred. What matters is recognizing that neither end of this spectrum on its own provides reliable evidence of the kind of sustained, demonstrated change that would actually justify immediate, full trust restoration. This trick very often emerges from genuine, acute panic rather than from cold, deliberate strategy. panic considerably more intense than anything explored in earlier examinations of avoidant reactions to loss, precisely because this specific moment represents the final, last possible opportunity to prevent a loss that has, until this exact point, always felt theoretically avoidable. This panic genuinely does produce real emotional intensity, real tears, real declarations that, in the moment they're spoken, may even feel completely sincere to the avoidant delivering them. This distinction matters because it explains why this trick can feel so convincing, even to people with considerable insight into avoidant psychology and considerable awareness of how manipulative this pattern can become. The performance isn't necessarily a deliberate, cynical con. It's often a genuine, acute emotional response, real in the sense that real panic and real longing are driving it, but still fundamentally unreliable as evidence of lasting, sustainable change, precisely because it's being generated by crisis rather than by the kind of steady, deliberate internal work genuine transformation actually requires. This is worth restating clearly because it deserves emphasis given how easily it can get lost amid the emotional intensity of witnessing this trick unfold. Genuine feeling and reliable evidence of change are not the same thing. An avoidant delivering this final trick may genuinely, sincerely feel everything they're expressing in that specific moment. That sincerity, however real, still doesn't predict whether the underlying capacity for sustained, consistent behavior actually exists, because sincerity generated by acute panic operates according to an entirely different mechanism than sincerity generated by patient, deliberate psychological work undertaken during periods of relative calm and safety, when no immediate crisis is forcing intensity into existence. There's a further layer worth exploring because it addresses something that makes this particular trick considerably more difficult to resist than ordinary, more transparent manipulation might be. This trick often specifically targets whatever the other person has throughout the relationship, most explicitly and most repeatedly asked for. If more verbal expression was requested, the trick arrives loaded with exactly that verbal expression. If more consistency was requested, the trick arrives with detailed, specific promises regarding exactly that consistency. If acknowledgement of specific past hurts was requested, the trick arrives with surprisingly detailed, specific acknowledgement of precisely those hurts. This precision isn't coincidental. It reflects the fact that an avoidant throughout the relationship likely absorbed considerably more information about what was being asked for than their usual behavior ever demonstrated, information that becomes available suddenly and completely once genuine panic finally breaks through the usual defenses, preventing its expression. This precision is exactly what makes the trick so difficult to dismiss easily, because it doesn't feel generic or hollow. It feels specifically, precisely tailored to exactly what's been missing, because it genuinely is tailored that precisely, drawing on real, accumulated knowledge about what this particular relationship actually needed all along. The problem isn't that this precision is fake. The problem is that precision alone, however genuine and however specifically tailored, still doesn't guarantee the sustained behavioral change actually required to make that precision meaningful over the considerably longer time frame a real relationship requires in order to function. It's worth addressing directly what actually distinguishes this trick from genuine transformation, because this distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to determine how to respond to it in real time, standing right at the edge of the decision this entire exploration has been building toward. The clearest, most reliable distinguishing factor involves what happens next, specifically how this initial burst of intensity holds up against ordinary, non-crisis circumstances once the immediate threat of departure has been at least temporarily addressed or delayed. Genuine transformation tends to persist and even deepen once the crisis passes, continuing to show up consistently during ordinary, low-stakes moments that don't carry the same urgent, high-stakes pressure that produced the initial breakthrough. The final trick, by contrast, tends to fade rapidly once the immediate threat of departure subsides, precisely because its underlying fuel, acute panic, specifically generated by imminent undeniable loss, naturally diminishes once that immediate threat has been successfully managed. This means the single most reliable test available for distinguishing between these two possibilities isn't anything that can be assessed in the moment the trick is first deployed. It requires waiting deliberately and patiently to observe whether the intensity persists once the crisis that produced it has passed. This waiting period deserves to be approached with real intentionality rather than simply happening passively, because the temptation to immediately fully re-engage based on the initial intensity of this performance tends to be considerably stronger than the temptation that follows more ordinary, lower-stakes avoidant behavior. It helps to name a few specific practical tests worth applying during this waiting period, because abstract patience alone can be difficult to sustain without something more concrete to actually watch for. One useful test involves observing behavior specifically during moments that carry no particular urgency or crisis, ordinary, unremarkable days, rather than the emotionally charged period immediately following the trick's initial deployment. Genuine change tends to remain visible, even during these low-stakes moments, continuing to show up consistently when there's no immediate threat of loss providing motivation. The final trick, by contrast, often fades noticeably once the immediate crisis passes, reverting back toward the relationship's previous, more familiar pattern once the acute fear driving the performance has had time to settle. Another useful test involves observing how the avoidant responds to reasonable, measured skepticism rather than immediate, full acceptance of their performance. Genuine change tends to tolerate this skepticism relatively well, understanding that trust rebuilds gradually, and that immediate, complete forgiveness isn't a reasonable expectation given what previously happened. The final trick, by contrast, often responds to measured skepticism with visible frustration, renewed urgency, or an escalation of emotional intensity specifically designed to overcome continued hesitation, treating patience itself as an obstacle to be pushed past rather than a reasonable, healthy response to genuinely deserve. A further useful test involves observing whether specific, concrete promises actually translate into specific, concrete follow-through, particularly regarding the exact behaviors that were named during the initial performance. This test requires genuine patience, since concrete follow-through, by definition, can only be assessed over time rather than in the moment promises are first made. But tracking this specifically, rather than allowing the emotional intensity of the initial performance to substitute for actual demonstrated behavioral change, offers one of the more reliable, objective measures available for determining which category a particular instance of this pattern actually belongs to. It's worth naming a reasonable protective approach here, one that doesn't require either fully rejecting the possibility of genuine change or naively accepting the initial performance at face value. This approach involves acknowledging what's being expressed without immediately fully restoring the same level of access and investment that existed before trust was broken, allowing enough time to pass, genuinely enough time, weeks rather than days, to observe whether the intensity persists once the acute crisis has settled, before making any final decision regarding how much weight this particular moment actually deserves. There's something practical worth addressing here as well, because recognizing this trick and choosing patient observation over immediate reaction still leaves open the question of how to actually communicate this choice to the avoidant currently deploying it, rather than simply withdrawing silently while internally running through the tests already described. This communication doesn't require confrontation or explicit accusation regarding the trick's suspicious timing, which, as discussed elsewhere in explorations of avoidant psychology, tends to produce defensiveness rather than reflection. It can instead involve a simple, honest statement of the actual position being taken, Acknowledgement that what's being expressed has been heard and received, paired with clear, calm honesty that trust and full re-engagement will require time and consistent demonstrated behavior rather than immediate declaration alone. This kind of communication serves two useful purposes simultaneously. It gives the avoidant a clear, honest understanding of what's actually being asked of them going forward, rather than leaving them confused about why their seemingly heartfelt performance didn't immediately resolve the situation the way it may have been unconsciously expecting. And it protects the person receiving this trick from the considerable pressure toward immediate full resolution that the trick itself tends to generate, replacing that pressure with a clearly stated, considerably healthier timeline built around actual sustained evidence rather than immediate, unverified promises. There's something important worth validating clearly here for anyone listening who has experienced exactly this trick, watched it work, felt genuinely moved and reactivated by it, only to watch its intensity fade considerably faster than expected once the immediate crisis passed. Feeling moved by this trick isn't evidence of naivety or poor judgment. This trick is specifically, precisely engineered, whether deliberately or not, to work on exactly the hope and longing that existed throughout the relationship's entire history. Hope that doesn't disappear simply because someone has made the difficult, healthy decision to stop actively pursuing its fulfillment. Being moved by genuine seeming emotional intensity is a normal human response, not a character flaw. And recognizing this doesn't require abandoning the healthy boundary or decision that was being made right before this trick appeared to interrupt it. It's worth addressing something crucial here regarding what actually happens if this trick succeeds, if the relationship does resume based primarily on this initial crisis-driven performance, without the sustained patient waiting period already described as the most reliable test available. In many cases, once the immediate crisis has passed and the relationship's continuation feels secure once again, the underlying dynamic that originally produced the need for this trick in the first place tends to reassert itself. The same inconsistency, the same withholding, the same patterns that eventually produced the exhaustion. This entire trick was specifically designed to interrupt and reverse. This means resuming the relationship based primarily on this initial performance, without waiting to see whether it genuinely persists, frequently produces a painful, familiar repetition, the same cycle beginning again, sometimes considerably more painful the second time, precisely because hope has now been reactivated and then disappointed once more, compounding whatever exhaustion originally led toward the decision to stop caring in the first place. This isn't meant to suggest that reconciliation following this trick is always doomed to fail. Some avoidants, genuinely frightened by how close they came to losing something significant, do use this crisis as a genuine catalyst for the deeper, sustained work required to produce lasting change, precisely the kind of undeniable consequence sometimes necessary to finally break through defenses that gentler circumstances never manage to penetrate. This possibility deserves genuine acknowledgement rather than dismissal. But this possibility can only be reliably distinguished from the more common, crisis-driven performance through patient, deliberate observation over meaningful time, never through the initial intensity of the performance itself, however convincing and however precisely tailored that initial performance happens to be.